So, what are the signs it's time for a redesign? Let's review some of the red flags. So, maybe you're receiving fewer website leads and not just traffic declines. With some of the core updates to the Google search algorithm, as well as AI overviews at the top of the search engine results page, we're seeing traffic flat or slightly declining. However, sites built with quality content and sound technical SEO are still seeing quality engagement, which with solid funneling and calls to action can lead to quality leads, not just traffic. Maybe your search engine rankings are flat and are dropping, and the dips can be normal, but consistent drops in rankings need examination. Your website doesn't accurately describe what you do. This can be attributed to very stale content. We'll talk more about that throughout the class this morning. Your website's users are telling you they can't find information. Now, users can also be your salespeople or customer service staff. These customer service representatives may be receiving complaints from customers and or prospects. You're contemplating a brand refresh. Well, that's pretty obvious. However, if you're considering a brand refresh, it's an opportune time to examine your website objectives and goals, especially if you're surveying customers and stakeholders as part of your brand strategy. You've added new products or services or solutions, or there's going to be an acquisition or a merger. And finally, what is your data telling you? Are you actively seeing gaps in your analytics or metrics tools? Maybe dwindling engagement, users leaving the site quickly, or quickly using site search when they come onto the site and then leaving right thereafter. All of these signs indicate a redesign may be something to consider. So I'm going to do a poll real quick here and see where we are in terms of your confidence that your website is meeting your business goals. So the question is, how confident are you that your website is currently meeting your business goals? Very confident, somewhat confident. Yeah, you're not sure. Not very confident, or not at all confident. Take a moment, please, and fill in your answer, and we'll take a look at what the group comes back with. All right, we've got somewhat confident and not very confident. Okay, well, that's honest feedback. I appreciate that. And I think we'll be able to ascertain that as we go through the class this morning. So thank you very much. All right, so with that, I am going to hand things over to Caitlin to talk about how we can set ourselves up for success and whether or not it's time for a redesign.
All right, thanks, Jim. So let's talk about some data. So how do you get confident in knowing that your website is achieving the goals you want it to? Well, you gather data that lets you know what's happening and whether things are going the way you want them to. Now, there are tons of ways that you can gather data about your website, and we do not have anywhere near enough time to talk about all of them. We'll touch on some more of them throughout some of the examples we'll give in a little bit. But the two that I wanted to highlight really when talking about data and using data to find those issues are Google Analytics and Microsoft Clarity, Hotjar, any type of heat mapping tool. Any tool that kind of lets you get ideas of how people are interacting with web pages, which I'll show examples of in a little bit. And the reason I want to talk about these in particular is I think that these two types of tools can really get you, I would say, at least 80% of the way there to really understanding how users are using their website and help you define some of those key issues that Jim was just talking about. So how does that work? I'll start with Google Analytics and sort of the red flags to keep an eye for in your Google Analytics. Now, for anyone who's unaware, Google Analytics is a free tool that you can set up on your website that lets you know how people are interacting with your web pages, what pages they're going to, how long they're spending on the page, how many people are coming to your site. Really, tons and tons of data can be gotten from Google Analytics about the performance of your website. And because of that, it's a great way to make sure that you understand how users are interacting with your site and keep an eye out for some red flags that might signal it's time to look into a redesign or at least a refresh of your site. Now, some big red flags to keep an eye out for are things like strange traffic patterns. If you've been using Google Analytics for a long time, you've got, in theory, years and years of data behind you that says this is how people use our website. But if that starts to change, if people start going to other pages on your site more and more often, or if we see them backing up and backtracking, on certain pages. We'll show an example of that a little bit later on a real site we worked with. That can all be signs that there's something going on that's causing them to interact differently with your website and requires a little bit of additional research. You also might see your engagement drop. Engagement being clicks on conversions, clicks on various links on your site, filling out forms, clicking to call, whatever those main calls to action you'll have on your website. If those start to go down, could be a sign that people are struggling a little bit and that there might be something we can look into in terms of solving that from the user experience perspective. And then finally, things like bounce rate. Bounce rate being the people who come into a page and then immediately leave. Now, sometimes that's okay. If it's a blog, for example, we expect those pages to have high bounce rates because they've come into the page, they've read the blog, and they're leaving the site. But if you're seeing high bounce rate on pages that you would think that they would continue clicking through, could be a sign that there's something that we can look into on the redesign side. Now, heat mapping is another way of getting that data. And so I'm using the example of Microsoft Clarity. That's who we tend to use. It's another free tool. There's also tools out there like Hotjar is probably one of the other major players in that space and also has a free version. And basically what heat maps do is they allow you to see different interaction areas in hot and cold zones. So for example, in this very first item here, this image we have here is an example of the scroll heat map, where we can see about how far down the page someone scrolls before they leave the site, with the areas where they scroll the most being red hot or orange or even yellow, and areas where there is little scrolling, they don't scroll past that point typically, being shown as blue or even gray, they're cold. The one next to an example of, this one's actually a movement heat map. So it shows where someone's mouse is moving on the page, where their mouse kind of hovers. And if there's a little bit of engagement, it might be blue. If there's a lot of engagement, there's red. Again, burns red hot when there's lots of engagement going on. We also see that with clicks and things like that. If there's lots of clicks, we can do a heat map of that and showing where on the page that they're clicking. So a really awesome tool, a great way to see how people are using your site. And again, there's free options out there. Just a good thing to always have running on your site. But in the context of our story today, they're a great way to, again, gather that data. So things like if we see people clicking on things that aren't clickable, well, they're clicking there. We can see that with the heat map, but we know from the way that the site is set up that that doesn't do anything. That's just wasting their time or they're trying to click something that doesn't work. It could be a sign that we need to refresh the look of that page or even look at the structure of that page to find out why they're clicking there and what they're trying to do. If we see lots of scroll drop off, so if you see here on this first heat map image, we see that it sort of fades off and this whole bottom area of the page is in sort of a gray, dark color. That means people typically aren't scrolling that far down the page when they visit the site. Well, is that okay? Is there something really important down there that we need them to see? That could be a sign that we need to relook at the layout of that page, and there might be some optimization that can be made through a redesign. And then the final thing is sort of the kind of similar to scroll drop off is unexplored content. If there's some big calls to action on the page and we can see no one's clicking on it, no one's hovering their mouse over it, no one's reading a certain paragraph of text, that could be a sign that there needs to be some optimization made, that why we want to look into why they're not exploring that content and what that content being unexplored really means. And finally, the one that I think is the biggest tell is something called rage clicks or erratic movement. This is when somebody frantically is clicking on something, trying to get it to work, and it's not doing anything. Or they're moving their mouse wildly along the page. Usually with these tools, we can get sort of recordings of these engagement moments as well. And that's a clear sign of frustration that someone is struggling to use your site, that they're trying to make something happen and it's just not working. That's, for me, the biggest red flag that you can get from a heat map of, all right, something's going on here. They're clearly frustrated. Let's take a closer look at what's happening. So our next section is going to be all about examples of putting this into action and how you can see this in place on real sites that we've actually worked with. But before we get into that, I'm going to do one last poll just to kind of see your thoughts on the site, on the sites that you work with right now. So are there any of these issues that you're currently struggling with on your website? Are you seeing issues with your navigation or user experience? Are you feeling like you have outdated or hard to manage content? Maybe there's some technical issues going on. Another sign of a website redesign that could help you out there. There's lack of mobile friendliness, or you're not sure. You're not sure. You're not sure where to start. Is there anything kind of calling out to you that, there could be something more that you could help with that you're just not sure exactly what's going on your site? So a couple more seconds to click the option that best applies. All right, navigation and user experience. We've got a lot of examples about that today, so that's a good one. As being the top answer here with 75%. And then 25% of you said outdated or hard to manage content. Another very common thing that we experience or we see users experience, and actually something that we'll touch on again with our examples. So you're in the right place and you're among friends. So we can jump into some examples of other people who have experienced those problems and kind of the approaches we took. So we're going to talk about 3 main issues. And those of you who said navigation, you're going to be happy with our first one because navigation confusion is the first one. I think navigation is probably one of the biggest red flags, and issues with navigation is probably one of the biggest red flags that we see as it's time to take a closer look at your website. And that means the user's going, oh, big bug eyes, I can't find anything on this website. I'm struggling to click around. Can't really find what I'm looking for. And that could be external users to your site and getting comments about that, but it also could include internal users. And if those of you who are using the site on a regular basis are struggling to find information as well, it's definitely a sign that your users are probably experiencing that too. So going back to those red flags, the common things that we see that navigation might be a concern on your site. If you're experiencing any of these things, it could be a sign that navigation is something to take a closer look at on your site. A big one is your support calls. Is your support center getting contacted about your navigation? Are people calling your support and asking about things that could easily be found from your perspective on the website, or things that you know are on the website that they're just not able to find, so they're calling support instead? We want to make sure that if it's available on the site, they can find it. And if they're not finding it and they're asking support instead, it could be a sign that your site needs to be revamped. In a similar vein, calls to your sales team. Whether you have a support desk for existing customers, or say you have a sales team as well that is working with new customers who have visited your site and didn't get all the answers that they're looking for. So they're having to ask the sales team. It could be a sign, especially if that content is already on the site, that your site needs to be revamped to better highlight that content for those new users. Another sign is online reviews. If you're a company that has online reviews for products or for your services, and you see them tanking because they're struggling to sign up with you or they're struggling to find things, we sometimes will see website concerns come out through those online reviews. And so keeping an eye on those reviews and seeing any kind of red flags of similar comments being made among users, especially if they're being made publicly in a review forum, probably a sign that you need to take a closer look at your website. And then the last one that we'll talk about from a broad perspective is users just flat out avoiding the site. We see this a lot when the navigation gets really complicated, that users will go to other spaces to get that same information that they could get on the website. So for example, we'll see it a lot in companies that have apps as well as websites, that if everybody flocks to the app because the site is difficult to use. Also, if you have sort of maybe a portal, a login area that users can get some information that is duplicated on the site, we'll see more portal usage because users are avoiding the website. So signs that they're trying to find other places to get that same information because they're trying to stay away from the website because they're unhappy with that experience or they're struggling to use it. Now, if we go back to our kind of main sources of data that collaborate this, the first 4 that we talked about are sort of external sources, people telling you information, looking at reviews, looking at usage, kind of general usage data of apps or hearsay about who's using your apps. All great places to start. But my favorite is when we can combine that for user-focused data with actual hard numbers that show that things are not happening correctly. And so that's where we come back to our kind of sources we talked about earlier, Google Analytics, heat mapping, as well as other sources that you might have data from. A big one in Google Analytics is if we can see what I like to call navigation backtracking. And that's when we can see someone going through the site, following a certain path, and then they go back. And they don't actually get to that call to action page that we want them to get to. They don't get to maybe the final product page. We don't get them to a form. But instead, we see them get part of the way there and then second guess where they're going and start over again. Maybe we'll go back to the home page or go back a step or so. To me, that's a huge red flag that for some reason they didn't find what they were looking for, or they got confused, or they thought they were on the wrong path, and they decided to backtrack. Something to definitely look into. Another thing is if you're running any sort of pop-up surveys. So SurveyMonkey is a good tool out there that can run pop-up surveys. Hotjar can do so as well. But if you've got pop-up surveys on your site asking people for feedback on their experience and they're only talking about your website, that's another big sign that there's probably something going on that could be improved on the site. And then going on to the heat map side of things, any strange clicks. So if we see any of those clicks on areas that aren't clickable, any rage clicks or erratic movement, anything like that, that might signal that they're getting frustrated with that navigation experience. So let's show a couple of examples of this in real life. If we look at this site, this is the site that we worked on. This is their previous site. This is their homepage, and we can see lots of different things going on this homepage. In reality, with this site, they had over 1,700 pages on their site that were kind of complicated for people to find their way through, and navigation was a major issue for them. For them, a big thing that we looked at was downsizing that content to something more manageable, both for them to manage as well as organizing it a bit by audience and showing things a bit more structured by the audiences who are using the site. So at the end of this example, you'll see two different sites that total 187 pages instead of the 1,700 that were there before. A much more manageable size of navigation and a much easier user experience. So what were those issues that we identified that allowed us to get from 1,700 to 187 pages? Well, a lot of it was things like duplicate content on multiple pages. These were 3 different pages that all had different calendars on them. Looking at areas of the site where there was duplicates and reducing it down to just one page makes it a lot more manageable for you on the kind of website end, of the web manager end, and also easier for your users because they only have to worry about going to one page for events versus more than one. The other thing we always like to look at is the usage of the different audiences on the website. In this case, there were 2 main audiences using their website, patients and doctors who are a part of the organization. Patients coming to the site were looking for things like help for scoliosis treatment for their family members, while the doctors coming to the site were looking for journal articles and educational information. Very different use cases of coming to the site. And when we looked at their current website navigation, their uses of the site were very combined. For patients, these were the various items on their homepage that they could access and get that information that they were looking for. And for doctors, it was on the same page, just kind of interspersed between there, making it a little bit of a different difficult navigation experience for both of them, as their use cases were sort of combined in one place. It led to a lot of backtracking, a lot of kind of getting to the places that weren't relevant to them and having to start over. And so what we wanted to do was really streamline those experiences. So for them, what it came down to is 2 separate websites with 2 very different user experiences, targeted at the needs of each of those different audiences. It allowed them to focus more on the needs of one audience, as well as allowed them to really consolidate down that content, get rid of a lot of that duplication, even focus in on things like the design of the sites to better tailor it to each of the audiences, and really allowed for a much more streamlined user experience without the complex navigation issues that they were dealing with before. Another thing on the navigation side, really kind of going back to that sort of duplicate content, is looking at things like layering of content. And by that, I mean, how many clicks does it take for someone to get through the site to get to those key pages we want them to get to? So in this case, this is a different website we worked on, also in the medical field. But this was a common path that they had a lot of different layers. So for example, this one, they would get to this page on the site. They would click into one of those calls to actions, get to another area of calls to actions, click on one of those before finally getting to the list of key information that user was looking for. And in reality, with their old site, 30% of the content required at least 7 clicks to access. Some of that being really key pages that they wanted users to get to. And a lot of times the experience was something like this, where they'd have something in the top navigation, they'd click on something from that, some additional navigation would pop up, they'd get sort of the propose a study, something that a lot of users wanted to do, They'd click on the outline from there, and then they'd finally get to the page they were going for. In this case, it was only 5 clicks, but a lot of them took even longer to get to. So for them, a big step was looking at these intermediary steps. If I even go back to the previous page, looking at pages like this and saying, do we need all of these pages? Can we consolidate this down to a single page, actually get rid of a lot of that intermediary stuff to make it a much more streamlined experience and get users much quicker into the site, much deeper into the site, much more quickly, excuse me. So for them, it was a lot of reviewing that content. And upon relaunching the new site, 91% of their pages are accessible in 4 clicks or less. I can actually say from talking to them recently, we were seeing that a lot of people were getting to the pages that they wanted to in about 2 clicks on average. So a much less, layered experience, much easier for users to get in. And if we go back to that data again, a great thing we can do after launching a site like this is get more data that shows that something is successful. So for things like, for this site, about a year after launch, we asked users that we had actually interviewed pre-launching the site, how's it going? Are you able to find things? And we got a lot of really positive comments of things like, we can usually find what we're looking for with ease, that they love a new search button. It makes it a million times easier, and everything feels attainable, separated accordingly, easily directed to what you're searching for. So really good signs that the site is much more optimized for the use of those users. And again, we can go back to the data that shows that things are working the way they want it to. The navigation is a big one, but let's talk about actually the other comment that a lot of you voted on. You're in the right place, which is content. And content can often, as we even saw with some of those layered approaches, can lead to concerns with navigation when it's a little bit complicated. So let's talk about a common content problem. Is things like users coming to your site and going, I'm interested in this, but I really don't know where to click next. I don't know what's the path I'm supposed to take here. There's kind of the other side of things too, is when you give people lots of options, we get comments like this, like there's so much text. I don't know where to go. I don't have time to read all of this. So content can cause a lot of issues in getting users to the next page. And really, the reality of it is when someone comes to your site, they spend on average less than a minute on a page. Usually it's even closer to things like 30 seconds for an average page is what we tend to see a lot in Google Analytics for our sites that we work on. So when you only have 30 seconds and you're giving them lots of different options or even not enough options, it can make it really complicated for them deciding where they need to go or what's the right path to take when that attention span you have them for is so little. Looking at the red flags for something like this, if we go to Google Analytics, it might be something like high time on a page. We can see with Google Analytics how long someone on average spends on that page that they're on. Now, sometimes that's okay. For example, if you've got a page that has a filter on it, for example, where they have to filter through things to find what they're looking for, we'd expect that to just take a little bit longer. But if it's a really basic page that we don't actually want them to spend that much time on, we want them to use that as a springboard to get somewhere else, and we're looking at more than a minute as an average time on that page, probably a sign that there's something going on there that we might want to clean up. We also can go back to our heat maps and look at where their mouse is moving. A cool thing with heat maps, at least for desktop computers, is that we can see on average where their mouse hovers on the page as they're browsing the content. Now you might say, well, they're not clicking on anything. Why does it matter where their mouse is? Well, users use their mouse almost as a version of their eyes on average. So we'll see, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving on the screen here, but they'll be looking at something and that's where their mouse will go. And they'll look somewhere else and that's where their mouse will go. So it's just a sign of where their focus is. And if we can see a lot of hovering in a certain area, there's a good chance that's where their eyes were focused as well. So it's just a nice tell of what are they seeing, what are they not seeing on a page. And then again, we like to go back to those users and their support questions. If we're getting lots of questions about things that you think are available on the website, or questions about things that you're getting from support that aren't on the website right now, again, signs that your content might need to be reviewed and looked at and optimized. So if we go back to that content, I think the biggest thing with content is understanding its power in clarifying the way that the page is designed, the power that that design has in clarifying the content on that page. So this is an example of a site this is the old version of the site, pre-redesign. And this was the content they had on that page. It was very kind of bulleted out, just a single list. Upon redesign, when that page was restructured, it looked incredibly different. We can see lots of different design elements that went in to optimizing that content in a different way. And I think the real power here is knowing how that design can be used to really make it clear what that content is. So here's a couple of examples. This is just a high level. And an example of this, we got tons of great feedback on this upon the feedback from the website. And, we got a lot of comments pre-design about that there was just too much information, that things were getting lost when the page was structured as a list. And a lot of that went away upon the redesign of the site. So here's some things that we did, at least in this example, that help with that. So if we look at the general structure of the page, we can see the previous site was actually broken into 3 columns. You had a column for the navigation, a main column for the content, and then a column on the side for the calls to action and things like that. In the new site, that's all a single column. It allows it to take up more space on the page, and it makes it seem page seem a little bit less complicated and more streamlined. So instead of at the top of the page, users' eyes being drawn to the navigation, the content, and these little additional resource links, we keep their focus just on the top bit of content and some of these kind of anchor links that we have on the page, which is where we want them to be focusing at this time. Another thing is looking at things like tabs and other sorts of design elements that can help break up that content. In this case, this is the exact same content. It looks completely different, I know, but it is the exact same content. Where instead of putting it in lists of bullets right here, these are now in tabs. And if you click through the tabs, you can get the same list of bullets. For me, I think that's a great way of, encouraging users to click on the things that are most relevant to them. And then they can also scroll through it if it's not relevant to them. It allows it to makes the pages seem a lot more attainable and easy to understand because we're not overwhelming them with information all at once. And then finally, even little things like, for example, again, this is the same little call to action stripe, but in the new version, there's a lot more white space. So it gives it a little bit more space to breathe and it makes it seem less clunky. And the next thing we want them to do next, instead of it just being a link in the text, it's an actual button that's called out with color and with design that makes it seem and stand out a lot more quickly. And when you think about them having only 30 seconds of time on average to focus, it's a lot easier for them to see something like a button than a link in the text. So it's just things like this. Again, this is really quick, high-level look. But the thing we really want to highlight here is that the design of the page greatly impacts the content. Where users on the previous site were saying that it was really hard to find things, that the content seemed overwhelming, a lot of times we can take that exact same content, bring it over to the new site, maybe some minor modifications, but change up the design greatly through content design. And it can make an incredibly improved user experience for the user and greatly change the experience that they have, make it easier for them to find things without even changing the content at all. So really powerful tool. If you're seeing issues with your content, it might be a sign that a redesign can be helpful for you, purely to look at how that page is structured and add some new design elements in there to help make your content shine and be easier for users to use even more. All right. And then the last kind of big picture thing we're going to talk about today, at least, is the major becomes minor. How do you understand what's a minor change and what's a major change? And it might be kind of stereotypical of me at this point, but we're going to come back to the data for this. But before we jump into that, let's talk about an example of this. Now, this is something that we've heard a lot from people before, people that we've worked with in the past. But we'll often get pulled in to make updates to a site, and we'll hear things like, the site looks fine, we need a couple of small updates, just a little tweaking here and there, and maybe a little bit of an updated design, but not a lot of major changes to the site, and it'll be fine. That's all we want for this time. Well, if we go in and we start talking to users about their experience on the site, sometimes we'll hear things like this. The website is old. Are they even in business anymore? Unfortunately, that was a real comment I did hear at one point. this is a big deal when these two opinions aren't in line. And that's why I think it's really important to always start a project with some research behind it to know if your perception of the site and your perception of the issues on the site match those of the users actually coming to the website on a regular basis. Because really, your opinion of it, while important, isn't as important as those coming to the site and using it, because they're the ones you actually want to reach out to. They're the ones you want to be able to interact with the site on a regular basis. And you want to make sure you aren't getting comments like this from the users coming to your site. So some red flags here is any of that closed door thinking. Coming into any sort of project where you're learning about the performance of your website, thinking that you already know the answer. Because we might go in and do some research and we might find out that your impression of the site is exactly what's happening. That'd be great. But you also might not. And so coming into any time that you're doing some research into the site, learning about the performance of the site with an open mind to what that data is actually going to tell you so that you can actually address those issues correctly. Really, a biggest issue is not doing that research at all. Going into a project like this and just making changes based on personal feelings of those in the organization or things that you've experienced with no outside data to collaborate that. Really, starting any website project with a foundation of data is going to help you make sure that you're focusing in the right areas and that you're actually changing the things that are the actual issues for the customers that you're trying to reach through your website. And kind of on that same vein, not speaking to others. In particular, not speaking to your customers. I think that going back to Google Analytics, looking at Clarity and other heat mapping tools is a great place to start. But I always recommend doing some sort of user research if you can, whether that's sending out a survey, conducting a couple focus groups, doing some user testing with anonymous users, in some way getting the feedback of those outside your organization, because it's always going to help you understand sort of the why behind the usage of the site. Google Analytics can tell us what pages people are going to, how long they're spending on the page, but it can't tell us why they're doing that necessarily. We can make observations and make guesses, but by talking to real users, we can hear firsthand what their experience was and make sure that we're addressing that in the updates we make to the website, making sure that we aren't treating a major problem as a minor concern. So here's an example of that coming out. This is a website that we worked on, and we talked to the client we were working with, the business we were working with pre-redesign, and they said, it's important that our website shares our resources with our members. They were an association of doctors, and they wanted to make sure that their website did a good job of sharing the resources that they had with the members of their organization. So we luckily had the opportunity with this project to talk to some of the doctors, talk to the members. And in this case, I'm the polka dotted vest wearing person, jacket wearing person. And one of the things I asked while talking to these doctors was, do you listen to the podcast? This was a big resource that they were publishing, a big resource they were promoting at the time was this podcast. And unfortunately, the main response I got was, well, what podcast? There's a lot of, unawareness. A lot of users were unaware that the podcast even existed. And in this case, it was because of the way, it was a few reasons, but really from the website perspective, it was because partially the way it was promoted on the site. This was the homepage of the site. You had to click into this professionals area, which gave you a navigation. And then in that navigation, you could see about halfway down the podcast listed. So it was kind of buried. People didn't really know it was there. So in the new website redesign, what we did is we made it much more prominent in the navigation. We had navigation on the homepage that showed the podcast, as well as content on the page that listed out the various resources available and gave a brief explanation of what they were. So in addition to just changing the navigation, we were able to update the site to match those user needs and bring out an issue that we didn't even really know was an issue until that happened. What ended up coming out of this new website redesign was that podcast got over 1,000 clicks to it in the first year the site was live, and they only have about 2,000 members, so a little under 2,000 members. So about half of their membership total in terms of getting those clicks to the site. So again, the design of the site, all of that can help incorporate those different, can help lead to those types of changes. But really the most important thing is making sure that you know the scale of what you're dealing with and making sure that you're addressing the problems that users actually are experiencing on the site is really the most important thing. That leads to, do you redesign? Do you not redesign? And Jim's going to take it away to wrap this up.
Thank you, Kaylin. So remember, the sign's pointing to a redesign, some of those red flags, right? So you're receiving fewer website leads. Your search engine rankings are dropping. Your site doesn't accurately describe what you do. Your site users are telling you they can't find information. You're going or anticipating a brand refresh. You have new products, services, or solutions to talk about. And again, what is your data telling you? So as Caitlin's been examining and talking about today, re-examine your goals and objectives, establish your data points, survey, and talk to users. Really important. Don't forget to talk to your sales and customer support staff as well. Consider a user test. It's an inexpensive way to gain empirical data and then go back in and fill all of your gaps. So that concludes the formal presentation. Let's move into our Q&A. And I do have a question here that was submitted through the chat. And we had one question ahead of time. I think the other question that was submitted was answered directly. So let me get to the one that came in to me through the chat. Can minor website issues really become major problems if ignored?
Yes. I think that's a great point. And I think, yes. So to go back, yes. I think the easiest way that minor issues become major is if they are ignored. So usually the thing that we recommend to do is to keep an eye on your UX. That's why we recommend having heat maps running, having Google Analytics running, and keeping an eye on it on a regular basis to look out for those red flags. So I think the easiest way that you get to that place where, oh, now it's a big issue, now we need to do a full redesign of the site, is when those minor issues pop up and they aren't noticed or aren't addressed. Usually when a little issue pops up, if it's like a single page, maybe a page layout isn't working correctly, that might be a sign that you don't need to do a full redesign. You just need to optimize that one page. And, take a look at the structure of that page, take a look at some of the data we have, and make adjustments to that one page. If that's ignored and that issue becomes an issue on other pages and it grows and grows and becomes a larger concern for your site, well, then we're looking at not just a minor change, we're looking at a major change, we're looking at a full redesign. So keeping an eye on your UX, keeping an eye on how users are using your site on an ongoing basis will help make it so that you can find and address those things before they become a major issue and make it so that you have to do a full redesign instead of just a little minor update.
Thank you for that. Here, a question just came in. This is an interesting question. Most of our members are retired and less tech savvy. What best practices should we prioritize in our redesign to make the site more accessible, readable, and easy to navigate for that older audience without losing appeal for younger or newer visitors?
That is a major concern. I get that. So I would say there's a couple things you can do. One is if you're saying that you have, new users and a younger audience that you're trying to reach, as well as an older, retired, maybe less tech savvy audience you're trying to reach, is to make sure that you have really clear content on the site for both of them. So maybe you have an area of your navigation that's just for, again, I don't know your data, but maybe you have an area of the site that's just for your retired members, and they know that they can come to the site. There's a really clear, link in their navigation that shows everything that they're interested in. And they can all be contained in one area of the site. And then you can make sure that those pages are really simple, really clear calls to action, really clear content for them. And then you can have a little bit more fun with some of the other pages that maybe you're trying to address some of those younger audience members. That's one idea. Really for you, though, the most important thing is that good UX serves everybody. So making sure that your design is really clean, that you've got really clear buttons, really the things that you would do to make the site usable for an audience who isn't super tech savvy, it's going to impact and help improve the experience for those younger members as well. So making sure that you are kind of just making sure your UX is sort of always up to date, that you're keeping an eye on things, making sure that your site's easy to use. is going to be incredibly important for you to make sure that every user can do it. As well as obviously the other low-hanging fruit, things like accessibility concerns, making sure that there's color contrast, things like that, are always going to be important for you as well.
Excellent, Caitlin. Thank you. And here's one other one that just came right through the chat here. If you had to pick one of the things that you talked about today, because I'm budget constrained or resource constrained, what would you suggest?
Ooh, okay. It's an interesting question. I would say Google Analytics is a thing that everybody should have on their site. I think that is by far the biggest low-hanging fruit is if you don't have Google Analytics on your site, get Google Analytics set up. I think Clarity is a great tool also because it is free. So if you're looking at budget, both Google Analytics and Microsoft Clarity, both free tools that you can just have running on your site. What I would recommend for a time-constrained person is at one time, take some time or work with an agency, whatever it is, to get a Looker Studio report set up, which will let you basically have a dashboard of all of your data so that you don't have to go in and search for things all the time. You've just got your data served in one place, so you don't have to go digging for stuff. So if you're looking for a time constraint, obviously time constraint, you can hire someone to help you. But if it's budget, looking at those tools are all free. Looker Studio is also free. And looking at getting that report set up at the very least to help you keep things tracked in one place.
Excellent. Good advice. And that is the last question that we have been posed today. So I'd like to wrap things up by mentioning that everybody attending the class today with a valid email address will be entered into a drawing to receive a complimentary mini UX audit. We will spend a few hours looking at your site after a phone call with you to determine what opportunities there may be to improve the user experience of your site. The winner of this drawing will be contacted in about a week or so. Regarding upcoming webinars, please join us on Thursday, September 18th, as we present Winning Digital Strategies for Higher Education. And on Thursday, October 9th, we're going to host the Hidden Power of a United Brand and UX Strategy. We talked about that today, in fact. As always, all of our webinars are complimentary and begin at 10 a.m. Central Time. You can also learn more and register at learn@northwoods.com. And if you're looking for information on a specific topic or just want to stay up to date on the latest trends and developments in the constantly changing world of digital, check out our blog, our recorded webinars, our YouTube channel, and our Around the Campfire podcast, featuring casual conversations with our experts on all things digital. We encourage you to check that out. And as I mentioned, we'll send out a link to this recording so you can pick up those URLs when we send that out to you. And finally, if you'd like to learn more about Northwoods and the many services we offer, from website design and development to custom software and digital marketing to digital advertising and marketing strategy, visit us at nwsdigital.com to explore our services and details, read our client stories, and much, much more. So that concludes our webinar today. I'd like to thank Caitlin and each of you for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. And until then, have a great day and a great rest of your week. Thank you very much.